What's up, guys? Welcome back to the channel. It's your boy, the Man Welding, and today I want to do some aluminum TIG welding with you guys and just kind of go over the basics and highlight some of the most common issues I see people encounter when they're learning how to TIG weld aluminum. So let's jump right into it. All right, today I'm running the Everlast 315 LX. It's a great machine, not a damn thing wrong with it. As you can see, we got a nice full bottle of 100% pure argon. And guys, the first thing you want to do when you're TIG welding anything, that right there, you want to make sure your gas is open, your gas lines are connected. Man, I tell you, that's something so many people get wrong so often, is they start welding and they don't have their gas turned on. So make sure, rule number one, you got your gas turned on and you're running the correct gas. Next, we're gonna go ahead and cut power on to the machine. Now, for today's example, I'm gonna be running a foot pedal. So let's come over here, and the machine's basically already set up how we want it. You can see we're running 2T on the foot pedal, running alternating current, high frequency TIG. Machine set at 205 amps. That's gonna be plenty for what we're doing today. And then if you come over here to AC, you can see we're running a frequency of about 120 and an AC balance of about 35. That's how I like it, guys. So, and you can also see we're running a water-cooled setup, which I highly recommend if you're gonna be TIG welding aluminum. Let's get started. All right, so this is what you're gonna need if you're gonna be TIG welding. This right here is a TIG torch, more specifically a water-cooled TIG torch. This is a CK Worldwide 20 style flex head torch, meaning you can flex it, you can put it where you need it to be. It's a great piece of equipment. And let's see, I'm running a number 7 cup, 1/8 inch tungsten. I don't know if you can see that, but I got it sharpened, not to a point. I kind of have the tip blunted. That's how I like to TIG weld aluminum. And you can see if I come down here and I step on that pedal, you can hear I got gas flowing. All right, that's a good thing. We want to make sure our gas is flowing before we ever strike an arc. Now that we know what we're doing, we got the machine set, we're ready to weld. All right, guys, perfect example of why whenever you're welding, you always want to get you a little piece of scrap metal and light up on it and run a few beads just to kind of, you know, shake out the jitters and make sure everything is running good. Because I was not the last one to use this machine. Whoever was using it before me was playing around with some pulse settings, and I was not expecting that. I overlooked it when I set up the machine, so it was a fun little surprise. So tip number 2 is, when you're getting ready to weld on something that matters, get yourself a piece of scrap metal and light up on it and make sure everything's how you want it to be, how you expect it to be, and you know, get a few practice runs in before you weld on the real thing. All right, so I'm gonna go ahead and change those settings on the machine and run a few more beads. All right, guys, so I wanted to make this video to highlight some of the biggest mistakes and the most consistent mistakes I see beginners making when I'm trying to teach them how to TIG weld aluminum. And the first and probably the most common one is what I like to call pussyfooting. All right, what do I mean when I say pussyfooting? I mean that they're just not giving enough amps. They're not putting enough amps down to that piece of metal to melt it and to get a puddle going. All right, so as some of you may not know, aluminum has an oxide layer on the surface, right? And the melting point of that oxide layer is higher than the melting point of the aluminum underneath that oxide layer. So what that means is, when you're trying to TIG weld aluminum, you gotta come in hot and melt that oxide layer, and then, you know, maintain that molten metal in the base material that you're trying to weld, and that's known as a puddle, right? So let me go ahead and demonstrate what I see a lot of people do. right, you see that right there? That is the result of pussyfooting. So essentially what they're doing is they're going to light up, but they're not putting enough amps down to really start melting this base metal. And instead what they'll do is they get eager, right? And they start trying to shove filler rod in there. And essentially all they end up doing is just having a globbed up pile of melted filler material that is sitting on the surface of their base material, right? That's not welding, that's just making a mess. In order to actually weld, you need to melt this base material, and you want that molten puddle to consume this filler rod as you travel forward, all right? So instead of letting the molten puddle consume the filler metal, they're letting the heat from the arc melt the filler metal on top of the base material, all right? And really there's a super simple solution to fixing that problem, and that is essentially to just fucking slam your foot down on that pedal and put some more amps down, all right? When it comes to welding aluminum successfully, you want to come in hot. You don't want to be sitting around waiting forever for a puddle. You want to puddle basically instantly and start welding, all right? And that kind of leads me into another mistake I see a lot of people make when they're TIG welding aluminum specifically, is they start off really cold, and then as they get going, they just continually put more and more and more heat down. So let me give you an example of what that looks like. All right, so in this second scenario right here, the one I talked about where people will start off cold and progressively just get hotter and hotter and hotter, that's like the opposite of how you want to TIG weld aluminum. If anything, the whole point of using that foot pedal is it gives you full control over the amount of heat you're putting into this piece of metal right here. All right, so you want to come in really hot, and then progressively you want to kind of back off of that foot pedal and reduce the amount of amperage you're putting into your workpiece in order to maintain a consistent puddle throughout, because the more weld you put down, the more heat is saturating into this workpiece, all right? So when I put this first weld down, this piece of metal was cold, you know, it was room temperature. And then once I finished this first weld, it was a bit hotter. And then I put this second weld down and it got even hotter. And then I put this third weld down, it got even hotter. So common sense would dictate that the more welds you put into this piece of metal without allowing it time to cool off, the less amperage you need to put into it to reach that same puddling temperature. As you can see, a big way to alleviate this problem right here, and what a lot of beginners tend to get wrong, is they don't make consistent forward progression, all right? So they kind of start and they just kind of dab, 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 dab in the same spot. So what I tell them when they're making that mistake is every time they dab that, they need to drastically move that forward. Boom, 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 boom. All right, you got to make forward progress. You can't just sit in the same spot forever, or else the heat is just going to saturate and expand, and you know, you're not going to have a good weld on your hands. All right, the third big mistake I see a lot of beginner aluminum TIG welders make is long arcing, right? And that's something that's consistent with beginning welders no matter what process they're using. It's very common when you're teaching stick welding, and it's very common when you're teaching TIG welding. So a lot of guys, you know, when you're TIG welding, or really welding anything in general, you want to keep a nice tight arc. So what that means is you want that tungsten to be very close to that base metal without touching it, all right? But what you see a lot of beginner welders do is they strike an arc and then, you know, see that? That's what it looks like when you're long arcing. Oh, they got their TIG torch way out here, and it's just no good. And it's, especially when they're TIG welding aluminum, you know, the sound of that AC current it can be intimidating for some people, and you know, it's like, whoa, they're just like, whoa, and then they'll try to overcompensate and they fucking slam their tungsten into the plate, right? So they're either way out here or they're just dipping their tungsten constantly. And neither of those are good. So a lot of times what I'll do when a guy is learning how to TIG weld is I will literally hold their hand while they're going, and I can feel them trying to slam that tungsten into the plate, and as soon as I let go of their hand, boom, just like that. They slam it every time. And you know, it's a beginner habit, but you need to break yourself of it as soon as possible. The ideal way to TIG weld is keep a nice tight arc without touching the tip of this tungsten into the workpiece, because if you do that, you are going to contaminate your tungsten, and then you're gonna have to stop what you're doing and clean it, because the number one thing I tell guys when they're TIG welding is keep a clean tungsten, right? If that tungsten's not clean, you need to stop what you're doing and clean it. When I'm teaching guys to weld, a lot of times the first thing I'll have them do is just carry a puddle, right? Just start off carrying a puddle. You know, and then once they're confident carrying a puddle, they're always so eager to get that filler rod and start adding filler rod. But the thing is, when you're learning to TIG weld especially, you just gotta be patient. So once they can carry a puddle, a lot of times what I'll do is stand to the side and I'll add the filler rod while they carry the puddle, just so they can get used to the sensation of seeing that filler rod dab into that puddle. And then once I've done that for them a few times, you know, I'll leave them to it. And the thing that I say when it comes to learning to TIG weld is, it's kind of like when I taught myself how to juggle, right? If you want to learn to juggle, the biggest obstacle is just bending down and picking up juggling balls off the floor. And it's kind of the same thing with TIG welding. If you want to learn how to TIG weld, the biggest obstacle is going to be constantly stopping and sharpening your tungsten. Because whether you're learning to TIG weld aluminum or steel or whatever, you're going to constantly dip your tungsten. All right, so that's it for the video, guys. I hope you enjoyed it. Maybe you learned something, maybe you didn't, but I appreciate you checking it out. And as always, stay safe. Love you guys. Catch you on the next one.